Bienvenidos, gracias. Soy Kiran. Vivo en Estados Unidos, en Tennessee, pero soy de Inglaterra. Voy a hablar en inglés porque mi español es muy mal. Lo siento, pero gracias por escuchar. So, buenos días, good morning, or as I like to say, now living in the American US South. Namaste, y'all. I want to begin by asking you all to close your eyes. I want you to picture your childhood home. What image pops into your head first? Perhaps it's a memory so thick and vivid that you remember every detail, every image, every smell, perhaps as clearly as it happened yesterday. You can open your eyes. For me, it's my mother's voice. To me, my mom was a divine feminine goddess, a lion, confident and strong. So when I'm about 10 years old and I was getting ready to go to school, I hear my mum lean out the front door of our concrete house in South England and call out in her loud, proud voice, "Tea's ready, boys." I come downstairs to find 10 burly men in our kitchen, sipping on good English tea in my mother's best cups and digging into a beautiful array of British biscuits. They were the neighborhood dustbin men or the garbage men, and there are so many of them they spill out into the garden. Their trucks were parked 4 deep out in the cul-de-sac street of Chaffinch Road, and they're laughing with my mother, telling stories, connecting. I'm guessing that as they collected rubbish in our neighborhood, this was their favorite stop, morning tea time at the Sirah household. Why is this memory so fixed in my mind? Partially because it's such an unforgettable image, but also because it happens so often. In the Sikh tradition, my religion, which emphasizes serving others, we consider sitting down to share a meal with someone one of the highest forms of prayer. To my mother, it was an expression of who she was. But mostly it sticks with me because of what it taught me. What my mother was showing, inviting the dustbin men into our home and sharing a meal on our best plates and cups, was that she valued and respected their dignity. From a tiny kitchen and a concrete housing estate on a dead-end street in a small town in South England, she was doing her part to build a fairer world, to dismantle historical inequality. She was taking aim at the oppressive systems and cultural violence towards communities that had been marginalized for thousands of years, all by serving tea to a bunch of strangers, telling stories, and providing a space for them to tell theirs. Now, I want you to close your eyes again. I want you to imagine that you're checking your phone right now and finding out that the leader of your country has decreed that you have 3 months to leave. And if you don't, you will be killed. He doesn't care where you go, just not here. And the place that you will end up, it will be a different season. You might look very different from the people living there, and perhaps you may not be welcomed. You're thinking, what do I take? Where do I start? You may be weighing in various possessions right now. You're thinking, oh, my photo album, or my mother's ring, of course, the chipped coffee cup that my grandfather drank out of every day, my laptop. Maybe you're thinking about all the things that you drank out of every day, or that you love, and people you have to say goodbye to because you can't load them onto your arms or onto your back. You can open your eyes. That's the dilemma that my parents faced in the summer of 1972. They were living in Uganda, in East Africa, their home at the time, and the country's dictator, Idi Amin, declared that all Asian Ugandans would be forced out or executed in 3 months. 50,000 people. Some fled to Kenya, others to Canada or India. But my parents, Sikhs of Indian heritage, went to United Kingdom. What little they did lug with them was stolen by robbers en route to the airport. And when they arrived in a small English town called Eastbourne, it was in the middle of a British winter. They didn't even have the right clothes. It was also in the midst of a terrible anti-immigrant wave in England. A lot of people hated them on sight. And that home I described to you, that little English cul-de-sac where my mother welcomed in strangers for tea, that was where my parents ended up. Now consider for a moment how much you carry in your heads. The human brain consists of about 100 billion neurons, and each neuron forms about 1,000 connections to other neurons. They keep combining so that each neuron helps with multiple memories at a time, which exponentially increases the brain's memory storage capacity to something like 1,000,000 gigabytes. And according to Paul Reber, a professor of psychology at Northwestern University, if your brain worked like a DVR, it would have enough bandwidth to hold 3 million hours of TV shows. That's like 300 years of TV. As we look around the space, on the digital space, in the room that we are in the Zoom or the Facebook, wherever we are, everyone around you has stories, memories, millions of moments from their lives that make up who they are, what they believe, where they've been, and also where they want to go. It's not just the anecdotes like, oh yeah, that one time when I was 11, the funniest thing happened. It's the lore that gets passed down from parents and grandparents, the idiosyncrasies, the history, the recipes, the music. It's your DNA. These are the gifts you will pass on to those that come after you. It's what binds you to the past. A story has the potential to hold time and to stop time. And if we're willing to listen, it's what binds us to each other. My storyteller friend from Alabama, Dolores Hydock, she would call the act of telling people your stories greasing the pan. It's a very important ritual, especially here in the American South, to get to know somebody before going too deep. When I asked my father years later what it was like to be expelled from his home at gunpoint and stuffed through a border into a country in the midst of an anti-immigrant backlash fomented by its government and enforced on the streets by skinhead thugs wearing green bomber jackets and DM boots with white laces, he said something I didn't expect. I expected something about the terror that he and my mother felt, the challenges and uncertainty of it all. And his response? No, son, it was fun. Me and your mum were young. We were 21. We had nothing to lose, and we were doing it all together as one family. We made new friends. Those were the good days, he said. Now, granted, my dad is a glass half full kind of guy. Yeah, Idi Amin, he wasn't that bad. But the point is, my parents didn't need material things to connect with new people and have new experiences, or to remember the old ones. They had everything they needed in each other and in their heads and in their openness to new experiences. It probably comes as no surprise that my parents stood out in their new home. My dad showed me our town's newspaper that he saved, one of the first new possessions from 1972. The front page headline of a local Eastbourne Herald read, Eastbourne receives Ugandan refugees. And there's my father, who wore a bright red turban and a colourful African shirt. And my mother wore a red sari. My dad loves to tell a story about a kid who saw them and yelled, look, Mum, aliens. He didn't mean immigrants, he meant aliens from outer space. Dad loves that. He still loves to tell that story. Most people in the town were good to my family, and their story became my story. I grew up in Eastbourne, which was right on the coast, and as the crow flies, was 50 miles south of London. You could see France on a clear day, and I spent a lot of time on the beach. I'd hang out with friends under the pier, or go for walks around the rocky pools. I'd eat fish and chips and pickled eggs, covered in malt vinegar and salt, wrapped in paper. The fat, soggy chips kept your lap warm. Anything left over, I threw to the seagulls. I remember walking down the street near my house one day and throwing a stone at a wasp nest and getting stung on my big toe. In a lot of ways, I was a typical kid. But I was also the first person with dark skin to be born in my town. We were brown in a white community, and that wasn't always easy. I have 26 stitches on this face. I've been beaten up so many times, I've lost count. A neo-Nazi knocked me from my BMX bike when I was just 5 years old. I've had my head stomped on and woke up in hospital. And on various occasions, the racism was always there, and I was always on guard. For me, there was a wasp nest on every other corner, but I accepted it just as a way of life. What was harder for me to deal was to deal with was that feeling like an outsider in my own country. When I was called a smelly immigrant or a Paki, I felt like a visitor, not a native. When someone would shout out, "Go back to where you came from," and I thought, where is that? I was born in England. I knew of no other place. I hated that feeling of always being the one and only person that stood out. I had to either figure out a way to answer back, ignore it, shrug it off, or find a way to maneuver through these conversations. We'll get back to that. But first, go back to where you came from. I want to focus on those words for a moment. When I was 6, I visited India for the first time. It was an incredible experience. I remember the sight and sounds of organized chaos, a cacophony of beeps and horns and Vespa scooters and Royal Enfield bullet motorcycles. The shops, the rickshaws, the markets, the street foods on carts and wheels, the thin, crispy puri with chickpeas, potatoes and various chutneys and hot sauces, and barley juice made from tamarind exploding in your mouth. The chai stands on every corner serving hot milky tea. I remember every detail. Once the hottest tea had been poured from the ladle by the chaiwala into tall glasses. Everyone, men in suits, children in school uniforms, teenagers in matching college attire, and women in salwar kameez, they all drank the same way, holding the glass with a thumb and little finger. My mother took me to one of our original villages in the lush green fields of Punjab in northern India. There were no rules and there was no curfew. What seemed like the whole village would hang out in one house with multiple activities going on. Some sat on cushions on the floor and watched a 6-hour Bollywood movie. The kids played up on the veranda. Older women would lead in folk songs and stories while keeping the beat from a dolki drum, or someone else tapped on the body of the drum with a metal spoon. It was more about just being there and sharing space than actually watching the movie. And while we were in India, my mother took me to one of the most famous langars in the world, the Golden Temple. Sikh temples are built around the langar, basically a community kitchen that offers free meals to anyone and to all visitors, no exceptions. The Golden Temple is like the world's largest soup kitchen, serving handmade vegetarian meals to around 50,000 people a day. We sat on the floor with everyone, rich, poor, men, women, straight people, trans people, all religions and colors and abilities serving one another, sharing a meal as equals. I never forgot that. Especially in India, where the caste system sees entire swaths of people as untouchables, not even worthy to eat food with. Eating at the Golden Temple didn't just feel good, it was like a political act that broke down the caste system one meal at a time. And back in England, my mother turned our home into a mini langar. One time when she was called for jury service, I came home from school to find the whole jury team hanging out in our living room, drinking tea. She embodied the Sikh philosophy of nirbhau, nirvair, which translates to no fear, no hate. Another time she made me clean the hundreds of pairs of shoes of congregants that had been left outside a Sikh temple in London. A lesson of teaching me never to be ashamed to do the work of service to others. What my parents did in Eastbourne and the way people responded became a blueprint for my life. They brought their culture and their stories with them proudly. Despite their differences, they kept an open heart and open door to their neighbors, even when that kindness was not always returned. They talked and they listened, communicated, they tried to understand. Where are you from? A simple question, right? People ask it all the time. For most of you, when someone asks, where are you from? You have an answer. But we're all from more than the town that we grew up. Where did I come from? England, yes, but also the villages of Punjab, the boats in Mumbai on which my grandfathers left India in the late 1940s bound for East Africa. I come from the railroads they built across the deserts on the coastal city of Mombasa, Kenya, to Jinja, a small town and the source of the River Nile in Uganda. I come from the well that my grandfather dug with his own hands, so the thirsty workers who passed by his house could drink fresh, clean water in the scorching sun. I come from the hut where my mother went to school in Tororo, a tiny rural town on the border between Uganda and Kenya. I come from the urban, compact neighborhood in Kampala, where my father grew up with 4 of his siblings. I come from the plane that transported them from the turmoil of East Africa to a different brand of turmoil in the United Kingdom. I come from all these places, some of which I've seen with my own eyes, others of which I've imagined 1,000 times, or hearing the stories that my family had passed down through the years. They are all part of my story. Home is more than about a physical place. It's in the imagination. It moves beyond borders, but the most creative place for making home will always come from the heart. Everyone in this space, we're all in the process of creating our own narratives. Our stories are not static. What have you learned from your family stories, and how are they changing you? And how are your stories affecting those that will come after you? Me, I listened to the stories of my family and friends and knew there was a bigger world out there beyond my hometown. I wanted to see it and to experience it and grow from it. I've called England home, but also Scotland and Northern Ireland and North Carolina, and now the hills of East Tennessee in the United States. I almost always stand out. Usually I arrive with little in the way of possessions, and generally I leave with riches of stories, experiences, and friends, and a greater sense of assurance, and belief in myself. Trains, planes, buses, my Subaru Forester car. These spaces of transition have become places of home for me. That sense of movement feels comfortable to me, and I find myself connected to others who have found themselves on the move. Go back to where you came from, sure, then bring it back to your new surroundings, proudly. Discrimination against people is wrong, and I believe that we're all in agreement on that. I hope so. But discriminating between people, and that is looking at how we're all different and belong to unique stories, is crucial. It's the best way to develop a world based on mutual respect and discourse. In Sikhism, the religion I follow, there's a philosophy, sort of like a call for duty, that you should go out into the world and adopt 5 different religions, or 5 different ways of life that aren't your own. You fully immerse yourself in those traditions and those communities. You learn the language, the poetry, and when you're done with the 5th, your journey is complete. You feel connected to others with different beliefs. You now understand what it means to be a Sikh and part of a larger world. In essence, you arrive home. Your lot in life is to learn. That is the same spirit of what I try to teach as the president of the International Storytelling Center, a non-profit organization based here in Jonesboro, Tennessee. If you remember only one thing I say today, let it be this: listening leads to understanding, understanding leads to connection, and connection leads to peace. Storytelling, regardless of the form it takes, helps fill in the completeness of who we were and what we can be. And it not only enriches lives, it can help us change the world. This nation, many nations, are in the midst of an identity crisis. The painful legacies of the past. In this nation, the Civil War, slavery, Jim Crow, it's always been there, beneath the surface. And it may feel like it's bubbling over at the moment. In this country or other countries, wherever you are, how do you see this particular moment in history? Is it horrifying? Is it sad? Is it dangerous in its uncertainty? Now, all these things may be true, but I also see it as an opportunity. Some of the greatest moments in human history have come from a collapse or an upheaval, which often sprouts movements that advance far beyond what we previously knew. In 2016, I got to listen to a talk given by Dr. Bernice King, the daughter of the great civil rights leader, Martin Luther King, when she came here to my region and spoke at the ETSU, the local university campus. And she said something. She said something that Black Lives Matter and Donald Trump have in common. Both of them have woken this country up to the great disparities that already exist. And regardless of political beliefs, everyone I have shared this with agrees. When September the 11th happened, I was living in a commune in Edinburgh, Scotland. There were attacks on a mosque and a synagogue shortly after that in my community. It woke me up. I finally understood the path I wanted to take. I began to understand myself and the outlines of the story I wanted to see in the world and how I could make it happen. You can't imagine how good that felt. I pulled out the phone book and I phoned every place of worship in Edinburgh. I invited Muslim imams, Catholic priests, rabbis, everyone to come together. 6,000 people showed up at that event, which was held at the National Museum of Scotland. Coptic Christians sang songs of resurrection in Arabic. Sikhs wore the Scottish Sikh tartan and performed traditional Bhangra with bagpipes. Jewish Scots performed music that combined Scottish Celtic and klezmer traditions. In other words, each group came together in a safe environment with a feeling of unity in the air, a feeling of hope, and they told their stories. Did it end the world's problems? No, but I'm willing to bet that after that day, many of those 6,000 people saw the world differently, and they took that new empathy with them back to their congregations. Yes, we are living in difficult times. The world is divided in so many ways. The way to bridge that divide is by asking questions, by talking, being willing to open ourselves up to make ourselves vulnerable, listening and listening in new ways. Now, this may seem impossible, an impossible large task, but it can happen on a personal level, one connection at a time. In 2011, I moved to the United States to become a Rotary Peace Fellow at the University of North Carolina. During my time in Chapel Hill, I spent nearly 2 years listening to people's stories at a homeless shelter, part of my own research on the aesthetics of home, the search for home through memory, through story. One man carried a love letter to a woman that he'd never sent in case he met her again. Another told me that he could only fall asleep in the shelter by visualizing being somewhere else, like the Swiss Alps or farmlands he knew from memory. I closed my eyes and I tried to make it so that it's nice, he said, like a home. I met 2 young men in a cafe that were living in the shelter. One came from the north, the other from the south. And they told me that they were both rejected by their families and met sleeping under a bridge one day. And since then, they found each other and fell in love. Their home existed in their relationship to one another. And they were now on that journey together. But none of my interactions stuck with me more so than Johnny's. Johnny was an elderly man. He was white. He had a weathered face and a scraggly goatee beard and a deep voice. I was used to having surface level conversations with most people in Chapel Hill life outside the shelter, but my conversation with Johnny went deep, fast. We talked about our personal circumstances and struggles, the world around us. I loved our talks. They were honest cultural exchanges, but I could tell he was holding back. He always seemed to be reaching for the right words that could describe his life as a shelter resident. We began meeting regularly, sitting outside the shelter and smoking cigarettes and chatting. One day, I invited Johnny to lunch. I asked him what he considered home, and his answer surprised me. He began talking about how he had been a professional baker and about all the food he'd cooked up for friends and family he once had, once upon a time, and how he used to get up early every morning around 4 a.m. and manage 32 ovens at the same time so he could produce thousands of southern biscuits in a single morning, usually while listening to Eric Clapton. As he told his stories about cookies and cobblers and how he turned Oreo pies into an art form, Johnny's speech became more natural, even exuberant. Baking was something he felt proud of, and he talked about with authority. It was almost poetic. We kept meeting and having conversations. At one point, he told me I was his only friend. Another day, he said, until I get out of the shelter, I will not be comfortable. Not until I can get to a place and start drawing money. To Johnny, home was not a physical place. It was a feeling of comfort he could revisit in his imagination. Where it existed on the map was not important, but I learned that his happiest memories were up in the Black Mountains of Northwest North Carolina. I was really good up there, he said. To him, a sense of home meant much more than having a place to sleep and eat. It meant a sense of becoming established, feeling grounded. feeling valued, belonging. On Thanksgiving Day in 2012, I went to find Johnny at the shelter. I wanted to share a Thanksgiving meal with him, but he was gone. I found out he had left the shelter and was told he'd moved back to the Black Mountains. Did our conversations lead to this move? I like to think so. Maybe talking about it enabled him to transition from shelter life sooner rather than later, back to a place of comfort. I miss him and can only hope that he has found a new sense of home. Now, what lesson can we draw from this story? Dozens, really, but we'll start with these. Everyone is a storyteller. Not many people were bothering to listen to Johnny anymore, but once he began talking about the thing that he loved, he transformed into a great storyteller. His stories were a way for him to make sense of his personal challenges and to battle against the stigma of homelessness. He just needed somebody's ear. Storytelling leads to understanding. Just by being there as he opened up, I understood who Johnny was in a way that his circumstances at the time couldn't possibly convey. As he opened my eyes, offering a unique way to think about notions of home, displacement, and diversity. Many of us are in our own states of homelessness, and that includes every one of us in this space. Because we are constantly searching for recognition, for a sense of community, for belonging. We all have a desire to be loved, and we have a desire and the chance to love. In other words, we are in search of a sense of home. Johnny taught me to understand the world in a new, more expanded way. Listening leads to understanding. Understanding leads to connection, and connection leads to peace. Imagine if the world were filled with more interactions like these. This may sound daunting, but you don't need to spend months building these connections. Just start with one person, one conversation. We just need the will and the forum. My dad would always say, "Oh, I don't have anything to say. I'm not a storyteller." But give him some whiskey and some masala chicken, then suddenly he's Mark Twain. And once you understand your own story matters, it's not a large leap to understand that other people's stories matter too. I live in America, United States, and I do my job because I believe in this country's potential to be a great peace player in the world. I've always been an outsider, an immigrant to 5 countries, and I've learned over the years to use that status as a strength, as the son of refugees, as a minority who has experienced marginalization. I use my old experience as a target of racial hatred, and I've worked hard to break through that silence and other barriers to help others. And that's really our mission at the International Storytelling Center, rooted in a small Appalachian town in the American South 49 years ago. We help professionalize storytelling and establish strategic partnerships with the US State Department, the White House, the Smithsonian Institution, the United Nations, everywhere from Silicon Valley to the Pentagon to Dolly Parton's Dollywood and the Imagination Library, helping to tell the shero's journey of coming back home. But at its roots, storytelling is a folk art. It belongs to the people. Every one of us and everyone we serve, those that you know personally and those that you don't. So it's important to us to bring storytelling to people as a tool, not just as an evening's entertainment. We're not just talking about people sitting on porch swings and spinning yarns over lemonade, though that's part of it. Storytelling has to evolve. We work to develop festivals, community events, podcasts, video games, downloadable toolkits for educators, anything that will reach people where they are and get them thinking beyond what they're told through a soundbite on the news. Sometimes we help rural hospitals or farm spaces, shops, family laundrettes become cultural hubs by transforming these places into storytelling spaces. Not everyone will come to an arts center, so it's important to go to them. When I took the job at the ISC, we call it International Storytelling Center, one of my first tasks was to go out and to meet potential donors. And here I was, the new guy in town, a brown European liberal in a white conservative region. And I thought to myself, how is this going to work? And one of the first people I met was a Mr. Scott Nicewanger. Scott is a self-made man, a highly influential philanthropist in our region. And when we met, the first thing he did was ask me for my story. So I told him about my upbringing, my parents fleeing Uganda, of a lot of what I've told you. And he smiled. He told me that not many people knew this, but during that time, he was a cargo plane pilot. He delivered food and goods to the refugees fleeing the borders into Kenya. I was stunned. It's not often I get to meet someone that already knew my story and was already part of it. I got to shake the hand of a man that helped my people thousands of miles away before I was even born. We were already connected and never would have known if not for meeting in person. Sometimes the listening leads to moments like these, the moments that will occur years from now. You never know. Our stories can affect our world years to come, even generations to come. Our paths cross over in so many unexpected ways. And if we can foster a listening culture, who knows how connected we might be. But you don't need to be an outsider or part of the International Storytelling Center to change the world. You can do it by listening. When marginalized people suffer, we must hear their stories and record the tragedy and the healing. So that record will be there 10 years down the line to remind us of a place in time we don't want to go back to. Nothing is gained by pretending these histories that are not necessarily rosy or wonderful, never happened. We go to Holocaust museums to understand our mistakes of the past and to learn for ourselves, because we are curious beings after all, and we have a desire to discover the truth for ourselves. A story told by a person is inherently good. It holds truth, as long as it holds truth for the teller. Our role is to listen. And here in Appalachia, in the United States, where we live, when someone asks, what does the Confederate flag mean to you? People tense up. Any individual who dares to answer the question is opening himself or herself up to attack. But as a symbol, the flag obviously holds different meanings to different people. In this space, we are professionals. We are in positions of power. And as leaders, we must be willing to create safe spaces for people to speak. It's not only our job, it's our civic duty. This may mean listening to stories that make us feel defensive, even angry. How far are we willing to go to listen? If we really believe in healthy discourse and dialogue, we've got to be willing to face the discomfort. We cannot be afraid. Remember that little cul-de-sac that I described to you at the beginning of this talk? So I want to end with a house on another little street in another small town. It's not the south coast of England, but rather right here in the mountains of East Tennessee. It's my street in a city called Johnson City. I have conservatives living on one side of me and liberals on the other. And in the middle is a modest house owned by a brown-skinned, beatboxing, English-born Sikh of British, Asian, Indian, and African descent, who periodically wears a kilt and plays the didgeridoo on the porch. I may as well be an alien. But we eat together, we drink together, we celebrate birthdays together, and even when we disagree, we listen to each other. I tried to make my house a lot like the one my mother made in England. In 2016, just before a Black Lives Matter rally, I hosted a dinner in my home. 5 people attended, 2 activists organizing the rally, the town's Republican mayor, an African-American clergyman, and me. I cooked all day, and when they arrived, I said, before we talk politics, we're going to break bread. The 5 of us ate spicy Indian curry together, and I watched the barriers melt away. And when it came time to talk, everyone told their stories and listened with an open heart. We came to some understanding about what to do going forward. The mayor ended up attending the Black Lives Matter rally. Because listening leads to understanding, understanding leads to connection, and connection leads to peace. Yes, 2021 is complicated, but if it feels like we're getting further away from understanding those different from us, it's perhaps because as a society, we're not trying hard enough. If it isn't coming from our elected leaders, the ones that we put in office, then we need to and should lead ourselves. And we can all do that. We can go deeper than the superficial stories we are offered on TV or online and actually talk to individuals about their lived experience. We can find the spaces in cafes, porches, local events for people to tell and to listen to stories inclusively. Just as there's no one story that makes up this nation, this world, there's no one story that makes up the places that we live, work, and call home. And in order for this work, we've got to start thinking of ourselves as artists and see the artistry that exists in all of us. You're a storyteller. Your story is your own to tell it, and it's different from anyone else's on this earth. So tell it, embrace the creative process, be willing to open yourself up, make yourself vulnerable, be honest, and let's find ways to listen to those stories that can build empathy and understanding. America, United States, Colombia, the world, it's made up of millions and millions of stories, heartbreaking, hilarious, poignant, complicated, infuriating, fascinating narratives that go far beyond 140 character tweet. These are the kinds of stories that can only come from personal contact, and all we've got to do is listen to them. So there's one question I want to leave you with, and I hope you'll be thinking about more and continue to ask others, and that is, what's your story? Namaste, thank you for listening, and gracias por escuchar.